So Adriana Bejarano is currently at the University of South Carolina. She has been an ecotoxicologist following her since her graduate training, since the time that she was in graduate school. We worked out that we have known each other for 23 years, which means that we were babies. We were little toddlers when we first met. And Adriana is going to do a systematic assessment of environmental issues, environmental costs that are surrounding coca cultivation in Colombia.
Thank you. And I do tend to move around, so if you get dizzy, just tell me to stop and I'll just quit moving. I want to try to move him over here. Sorry. Okay, perfect. So my talk is gonna be slightly different from what you have seen thus far. And my focus is really gonna be entirely environmental. And I'm not gonna talk about costs and money of replacing environments, and none of that, but rather what are the different impacts that illicit crops are currently having or could have in the regions of Colombia. So the mouse, okay. I have no idea how to change to the next slide. Okay, here we go. So as you can see, Colombia is right here. Coca cultivation started in Colombia, as Paul mentioned, back in the 70s, but it wasn't until the 90s when Colombia really started being the top producer of coca in the world. And the trends have been reducing, but that doesn't mean that the war on drugs is over. It's really far from over. And what I thought I'll do today is I'm just going to talk about some of the environmental effects that are happening in the landscape of Colombia, starting from before a coca crop is planted, and also moving to what happens during the coca season and what happens afterwards, which is sorry, I guess I have to answer for something. Sorry. And then I'm going to talk about what happens when the coca leaves are transformed into cocaine. And I'm briefly going to talk about the eradication strategies that have been implemented by the Colombian government. So all of these steps are going to have some either perceived or actually realized impacts on the environment. But I do want to point out that these two, the land clearing and preparation and the crop maintenance, those are not aspects that are unique to coca crops. These happen in many, many crops. But what I do want to point out is that even though Colombia has faced illicit crop production for many decades now, we really don't have a good comprehensive understanding of what the environmental impacts, and those could be actually cumulative impacts in Colombia. So I'm going to talk about the environmental impacts associated with the phase prior to coca planting. So as you can see in these photos, the Colombian government estimates that for every hectare of coca that is planted, we are losing between up to 4 hectares of primary or secondary forest. So recently, we started looking at the land cover series change between 2002 and 2007. We looked at a series of variables, trying to understand if we could see a signature of coca crops and the loss of forest in Colombia. So what we found, and just to put things into perspective, the red ones are the forest lost during this period, and you can see some of forest gains right here. So to put things into perspective, Colombia is the size of Texas and California combined, and during this period, Colombia lost an area approximately the size of Maryland. So that was a huge forest loss. We found that in the northern part of Colombia, the rate of annual deforestation was 4.7, in the central region 3.8, and in the southern region 0.8% per year. And in the southern region, actually we didn't really see, overall we didn't see a close link between coca crops and deforestation. However, in the southern part, we found that the probability of forest being lost to coca crop was a function of the distance to the coca crops as well as the area of coca crop planted. And in the southern region, currently we have, I want to remind you that we looked at the 2002 to 2007 series. the southern region has remained, the stability of the coca crops has remained stable or has even increased, particularly in Nariño and Chocó, which means that maybe these deforestation rates that we estimated to be 0.8 may actually be slightly higher. And the other issue we had is that in the southern part of Colombia, we have issues with cloud cover. So again, these were really interesting analyses, but we did not overall find a strong link between deforestation and coca crops, although there was a very good correlation with density, which may be an indirect indicator of some other things happening. So after a forest is cleared, what happens next is that there is semi-controlled burn of the area, which can lead to another cascade of issues that we haven't really fully addressed. There is probably a loss of ecosystem services, loss of habitat and biological resources in the area, and changes to the local landscapes. And that is definitely an issue that needs to be addressed in more detail. And what we do know is that the removal of these forested areas also has been linked to increasing landslides in coca growing regions. And you can see photos here where a coca crop has been, a forest has been removed, and there is a clear scars on the landscape. And in this photo right here, this is a landslide about to occur, and right here you have the coca crops. So what we wanted to do to try to have a better understanding of what could happen in some of these regions was we started looking we tried to develop a landslide vulnerability index, where we first started looking at about 20 variables, but we ended up reducing our models to the variables that explain landslide vulnerability best. And so what we have in this map here is the landslide vulnerability for Colombia in the regions where coca crops have been found or where they're currently present. So as you can see, the landslide vulnerability in some of the areas that have been planted with coca are moderate to high, and these are highlighted in the yellow and red areas right here. But what we feel that is really troublesome is that some of these coca crops, we estimate between 4 to 8%, have been planted in areas that are prone to landslides. So that is definitely an issue, and there have been some incidents in the Antioquia and Cauca regions where some landslides may have been actually caused by the destabilization of the soil caused by coca crops. So that is definitely an issue that we're trying to address. So that now we cover what happens before a coca crop is planted. Then we move into the potential environmental effects of the coca crops themselves. So as you can see here, there is a large number of chemicals that are used to maintain these crops. And we also have noticed different regions, different regional differences. For example, in some areas that are really not good for agriculture, they may actually use excessive amounts of fertilizers to prepare the soil. And in other areas, they may have a higher incidence of pests. So therefore, they may have to actually use more pesticide in some areas than in others. And so what I think is interesting about some of this is that there is really a no water treatment of any of the waste that is produced during the maintenance of these crops, which is somewhat troublesome because we know or we suspect that a lot of these wastes are being dumped onto soils and into rivers. And so the other issue is that a lot of these coca crop, the residues and the containers that are used in pesticide use actually are discarded or burned, which could also have all sorts of issues. And what we also have reported is that some people actually reuse some of these pesticide containers, which is also, in terms of human health, is definitely an issue. And I don't have many data to show, but I just kind of wanted to highlight here the amount of fertilizers or actually pesticides that are used in a coca crop versus 2 other crops. And it's not a fair comparison because I only have 2 crops, so we don't really have a good grasp of the use or overuse of pesticides in coca growing regions. But these numbers, at least compared to these other 2 crops, seem to be alarming. So we don't have currently a good understanding of the risk from pesticides themselves. We know which pesticides are actually being used in coca growing regions, the frequency of use, and a lot of these pesticides have actually been studied quite a lot by the US EPA and other agencies. So we know we have a good understanding of where what the fate of these pesticides would be and where they're going to end up, if it's the soil or water. And what is also interesting and also troublesome is that many of these pesticides, the large majority of the pesticides that are used, are moderate to very highly toxic to aquatic fauna. So even though we don't have the necessary data to do a full risk assessment on pesticides in coca growing regions, there are some troublesome signs out there. What I'm showing here in this map is just really the proximity of primary and secondary water bodies to the areas that have had or that currently have coca. So as you can see, the red areas or the red marks are the rivers that may actually be receiving the pesticide runoff, that kind of thing. So even though we don't have the necessary data, well, there are some signs out there that we should definitely look in more detail. So now I talked about what happens during the maintenance phase, and what I want to discuss very briefly as well are the impacts associated between the conversion of coca leaves to cocaine, right here. And so very briefly, coca leaves are is transformed into paste, paste into base, and base into cocaine. And through all of these steps, there are large quantities of chemicals as well as water that are used in each of these processes. And so far we've estimated, or the Colombian government has estimated, that for every kilogram of cocaine, you have about 219 liters of gasoline, for example. So we're talking about large quantities of chemicals, and the waste of this, of course, is not being treated. And again, the likelihood of these chemicals and products ending in soils and waters is really troublesome to some of us. And here we have a pretty good picture of what we could find in some of the areas where the coca leaves are being processed. High level of contamination, chemicals and containers left behind. And what is also interesting is that over the more recent history, a lot of the people involved in some processes, especially the conversion of paste to cocaine, they have become capable of recycling some of the solvents that are used during these processes. And so that requires large quantities of water, which are, I mean, that they use large volumes, and they also have, because of these processes of recycling, the water is heated up to temperatures up to, say, for example, 120 degrees. And these waters are, without any treatment, dumped back into the receiving streams. And we have anecdotal accounts that some areas in the proximity of a laboratory right here are completely, the aquatic fauna is completely absent. So we are definitely concerned about the ecological effects that these laboratories are probably having in water resources around Colombia. And also part of the response of the Colombian government is to identify these laboratories and destroy them. And because some of these are in some areas that are rather inaccessible and it's difficult to move large quantities of chemicals, this is what in some cases it happens. These laboratories are destroyed, and again, there is a high risk of contamination of the soil, groundwater, and adjacent water bodies. So we recently started looking at the location of some of these laboratories with focus on the 2011 laboratories, trying to identify hot spots for where these labs may be. And what I'm going to show you is a really good division between the paste and base laboratories and the cocaine laboratories. And the reason why I'm splitting this is because until recently, the paste and base laboratories involve the same coca growers, up to about 25% of coca growers, for example, were until recently involved in the production of paste. And virtually a very small percentage, less than 1% of the coca growers are involved in the cocaine processing. So the analyses are going to split between these two groups of labs. So in 2011, there were over 2,200 laboratories found in Colombia. And we have georeference information for some of those, 426 for paste and base laboratories and 88 georeference points for cocaine laboratories. And so I want you to ignore this panel right here. We started looking at what variables explain the presence or absence of some of these laboratories. And with regards to paste and base laboratories, we found that the variable that explains the most the presence of these labs is the presence of coca crops, which is, I mean, it's pretty obvious, but it's really nice to show it quantitatively that that is really the case. The next variable that contributes to the presence of these laboratories, at least paste and base, is elevation. And so we could see there's some correlation between some of these two variables. And the rest of the variables, many of which include access, say for example, access to rivers, access to roads, access to national parks, they contribute about the same amount, 6 to 8%. And to my surprise, the presence of forests really contribute the most. I would have thought that since they are looking to just be able to find places hidden from the view of the Colombian government, that the presence of forests would provide that refuge. But it seems like there are other variables that are more important. But when we looked at the cocaine laboratories, we see a complete change in the relative contribution of these variables. And in this case, the variable that explains the most the presence of cocaine labs is the presence of paste and base laboratories. Again, it all makes sense, but it's nice to see it quantitatively. And then the next variables that are important, at least for cocaine laboratories, are access to urban centers, which again, it makes sense because a lot of the people who are involved in these processes are more of the urbanized areas, followed by distance to borders, which also, it all makes sense, but again, showing numbers is kind of put things into perspective. And the rest of the variables that we thought were going to be important, they contribute a lot less to the percent or to the probability of finding a cocaine lab. So I'm going to show you some of the spatial analysis that we have done, first showing at the paste and base laboratories. And in this model, it seems like these laboratories seem to be very predictable in space. So the probability of not finding a lab is very low in areas where labs are actually absent. And the probability of finding labs, paste and base laboratories in areas where these labs are present, even though we cover the whole range of probabilities from 0 to 1, most of them are concentrated in the 0.4 to 0.8. So that's telling us that these models are somewhat accurate. And so we have identified regions that may probably have a high probability of having laboratories. And those are the regions, for example, Nariño, Putumayo, and Caquetá right here, which are areas with high prevalence of coca. And also the region of Antioquia. Now we looked at the same results, but for the cocaine labs, our models are not as accurate because we have a lot smaller sample size or location of some of these laboratories. But then again, we still are able to predict where the labs are present or absent. And so here again, we have the probability of finding laboratories, that will be the dark, and on top I'm just putting the actual location of these cocaine labs. And what I mentioned before was the distance to borders and distance to urban centers seem to be very important, as well as distance to paste and base laboratories. And what we find is that virtually almost the entire shoreline of the Pacific coast are ideal areas for the presence of cocaine laboratories. So we don't know if they are there because we have a reduced data set, and we're trying to find more information to see if our models are actually predicting somewhat accurately where these laboratories are. But as you can see, there is a good probability that these laboratories are going to pop up in many of the regions of Colombia. And I briefly want to touch on the aerial eradication. Aerial eradication started in Colombia back in 1997 with the introduction of glyphosate, which is a non-specific herbicide. And this map here shows the application of this pesticide, which again, herbicide actually, which is concentrates in the region of Nariño, Putumayo, Caquetá, Antioquia as well. And so on average, the Colombian government sprays or has eradicated between 2002 and 2011 about 100,000 hectares of coca per year on average. So that has had unintended consequences, not necessarily environmental, but the environmental consequences may be there. There is debates of whether or not this extensive use of this herbicide has had effects. So I don't think there is a solid answer to that yet. But some of the unintended consequences is that these farmers are very, they adapt to the new pressures. So they may choose to either increase or decrease the size of their plot to prevent their plots from being spread and therefore ensuring the productivity of their areas. There is also crop mixing with other products that are used for consumption, and also there is the risk of downspray of impact of unintended vegetation. And what is also interesting is that based on what you heard from Diana, the fact that the government is spraying some of these areas is causing people to feel neglected by the government and just finding more separation between them and the government, feeling that the government is not to be trusted, which again is very controversial. So why should all be concerned? I showed briefly how the presence of coca crops have the potential to transform the landscape in Colombia and also have the potential to cause widespread contamination. And again, I do want to point out and remind you that at the beginning of the talk I said that some of these effects are not exclusive to coca crops. There are other crops where we use pesticides, so we have to put things into perspective. But the ecological effects from these crops in particular has not been fully resolved. And what we find interesting is that even the national parks, which are these yellow polygons right here, they are not immune to the presence of coca. Even though we know, and also from what you heard from Dollars, coca crops is not as abundant in national parks, but they are in fact found in these regions. And what is also interesting is that some of these paste-based laboratories have also been found in national parks. So there is some reason for alarming. So you could see this national park here has some paste-based laboratories as well as the ones here and some others here. And the reason why this is troublesome is because even the areas that we are intended to protect are not necessarily immune to the potential environmental effects derived or caused by illicit crop cultivation in Colombia. And I could list an extensive reason of why we should all be concerned. And I do want to point out, as it was mentioned before, that Colombia is a mega diverse country. So the large scale and the loss of habitat is really problematic in this country. So what are some of the challenges? And just kind of to finish up. We have been discussing this week the struggles of getting access to data and access at the appropriate scale that would allow us to answer specific questions that we are all concerned about. And having good quality georeference information is also critical. As you have seen in all the presentations thus far, we have relied heavily on georeference data because that's what is relatively easier to collect and what is gives us a bigger picture of what could be happening. And again, another thing that we all feel that is interesting is that coca crops are diversifying. The activities are now moving into either legal activities such as cattle ranching, or it can also be moving now into illegal mining. That's something we unfortunately don't have time to discuss, but we have found a very good link between the increase of illegal mining in areas that are prone or that have had large quantities of coca area. And as we have been discussed within our group, we definitely have to come up with better strategies of sampling and data collection that would allow us to answer specific questions that are of relevance not only to us as a scientist, but also to the decision makers in Colombia. So hopefully, with this interdisciplinary group that we have formed, we're going to be able to generate the information that is needed just to prioritize some of the issues that we have identified in Colombia. And the other thing that I think is great to have some of you here is that we're really trying to increase not only national but also international awareness on all the different aspects related to coca crop cultivation. So that is really great. And again, some of the greater limitations that we have as scientists is access to funding. So once we get a little money or a lot, it would be great. We'll be able to address a lot of the issues or something. Yeah, exactly. We'll be able to study in more detail some of these issues. That is all what I want to say. And of course, this kind of research cannot be done by one person. It really takes a team to answer specific questions. And And we have here some of our collaborators and contributors. So that's all I have, and thank you very much.